Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Matt Abbott. I am the Director of Government and Diplomatic Programs here at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. I'm honored to welcome Minister Ciarán, who is visiting us from Ireland today. We are absolutely honored to host him on our platform. I'd like to extend a thank you to the Irish Consul General Brian O'Brien and his fantastic team at the consulate who have been so helpful with this program. Also, thank you to our event partner, the Ireland Network Chicago. Please note that we are on the record and we are live streaming today's program. We also welcome your engagement on social media, but please silence your phones. We will be taking audience questions later through an online app as well as directly from in the room. To ask your questions online, please type chi.cnf.io into your browser. For nearly a century, the Council on Global Affairs has provided an independent, nonpartisan platform for a variety of different perspectives to promote deeper global understanding and active U.S. engagement in the world. Views expressed by individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. Before I turn it over to the Minister, I would like to spend a few moments introducing him to you. He is Minister of State at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade with special responsibility for the diaspora and international development. Formerly, he served as the Minister for Training and Skills at the Department of Education and Skills. He serves as a member of the Irish Parliament representing Galway East. I will return later to moderate the question and answer session with the audience, but now please join me in welcoming Minister Ciarán.
Thank you, Matt, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be here at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs this afternoon. The Council has a reputation for excellence that extends well beyond this city and this country across the Atlantic to Ireland, and it's a great honour to address you on the topic of Brexit. Your great philosopher H.L. Mencken once noted that for every complex problem there is an answer that is clear, simple and wrong. And Brexit certainly is complex, and at this point in time there are no clear or simple answers to that challenge. And my address today comes at a time of great uncertainty for Ireland, because Brexit has unfortunately injected much strain into our most important bilateral relationship, that with our closest neighbour, the United Kingdom. Brexit has also added to the challenges that we face in sustaining the Northern Ireland peace process, and as we work with the British government in finding a way forward on the current political impasse in Northern Ireland. But one thing is clear as I speak to you today from this global city. Ireland faces these strategic challenges, certain in our role as a global island, looking outward and fully involved with the world and at the heart of Europe. And it's through that prism, it is through this outlook that we can best look to resolve what are unprecedented political, economic, social and diplomatic challenges that are posed by Brexit. So we need to navigate these challenges in a very level-headed, a very clear-eyed and a very practical way. Because Ireland will be more affected than any other EU member state by the decision of the UK to depart from the EU. And that relationship that we have with the UK, it's very unique because of the strength of the historic, the human, the political, the economic and the cultural ties which bind us. And I live on the west coast of Ireland in County Galway. And I think it would be exceptionally difficult to find a neighbour of mine living anywhere in the community that I live in that doesn't have a relative somewhere in the United Kingdom. And the United Kingdom remains our single most important economic partner country. However, it's worth noting that our trade with the rest of the European Union is more than double the trade that we have with the United Kingdom. And interestingly, the United States is the top source of inward investment into Ireland. So for Ireland, our strategic objective of the Brexit negotiations is very, very clear. We want to create the closest possible future connection between the EU and the UK, and that connection needs to recognise and support the vast extent of our common interests, whether they are economic, security or political. We want a very smooth and cordial separation between the UK and the EU. And it's in Ireland's interest and the interest of the European Union as a whole to have a confident and a cooperative UK on our doorstep. After all, we cannot alter the basic facts of geography and of history. The other key strategic objective for us is to ensure that the outcome of Brexit does not in any way undermine the very hard-won and valuable gains of the peace process achieved through the Good Friday Agreement. And ladies and gentlemen, next month, on April the 10th, we will mark the 20th anniversary of that agreement. The agreement gave rise to the establishment of a Northern Ireland executive, a power-sharing government that consists of the main parties in Northern Ireland, and those of you who follow Northern Ireland politics might know that that executive collapsed over a year ago and unfortunately remains suspended. Some might say that this demonstrates that the agreement has failed, but I would say to you it has not failed. It has delivered that most valuable of things. It has delivered peace. And 20 years of peace on the island of Ireland is a wonderful achievement after so many years of conflict. And I recall vividly growing up as a young Irish teenager, a young Irish man, and all through those years, my formative years, of hearing of atrocity after atrocity, men, women and children brutally killed, and those memories will remain with me for my life. My son, who has just turned 21, has no experience of that whatsoever. Never will have that recollection of seeing those horrible atrocities carried out. And that, for me, and for the communities of Ireland and the people of Ireland, is the true and intrinsic value of the Good Friday Agreement. John F. Kennedy addressed our Parliament, the Oireachtas, in 1963, and said that no country had done more for the cause of Irish freedom than the United States. And today I want to highlight that, as well as helping us in that time in securing Ireland's nationhood, no country has done more for peace on our island than the United States. The support of successive administrations over so many years helped Northern Ireland to secure that very precious prize of peace. And the people of our island owe a great debt to heroes such as Senator George Mitchell and to all of those that were involved in that process. So the US should be very proud of, together with Ireland and the UK and the people of Northern Ireland, all of us should be proud of that great achievement. And today, the Irish government remains committed to protecting the Good Friday Agreement and the gains of that precious peace process. And despite recent setbacks, it must be remembered we have come a very, very long way since the dark days of violence and conflict on our island. There is no doubt but that Ireland and the UK's common membership of the EU has contributed significantly to a point where relations across our islands have never been better. The UK and Ireland joined the European Union on the same day, on the 1st of January 1973, together with Denmark. And our common membership and the shared EU rules that we helped to create have facilitated and developed our cooperation, yes, in the economic sphere, but much beyond that, in important areas like aviation, research, and the environment, but in human terms also. Politicians, diplomats, and civil servants grew more familiar with one another, found it easier to work together as they sat around the same EU negotiating tables, and met in the same corridors day in, day out. And this factor was not unimportant in developing an atmosphere of trust, facilitation, partnership, which Ireland and Britain could cooperate with in building peace in Northern Ireland. And that's why protecting the peace process and the Good Friday Agreement is such a central dimension of the Irish government's approach to Brexit. We want to protect that peace process. We want to do that by avoiding a hard border on our island. We want to maintain the common travel area with Britain. We want to protect North-South cooperation. And we want to safeguard the EU citizenship and other rights of Irish citizens living in Northern Ireland. And it's important to note that while the European Union is not in fact mentioned in the Good Friday Agreement, but that was because both Ireland and the UK were members of the EU at the time, and future membership at that time was taken as an absolute given. So that common membership has ensured that very many areas of North-South cooperation are supported by or rely on the framework of EU law. And this cooperation between North and South has contributed greatly to the normalisation of relations on the island of Ireland, bringing significant economic and social development, particularly to those counties north and south of the border. Non-discrimination and the protection of human rights have been reinforced by the obligations of EU treaties. The European Union has given financial support to projects aimed at fostering reconciliation and cooperation within Northern Ireland and between both parts of the island. Between the long-standing common travel area between the UK and Ireland, the creation of the EU single market and the removal of customs posts and the removal of security posts made possible by the Good Friday Agreement, the political border between our two countries has become invisible. It's just like crossing a state line here in the US from one state into the other. Although our border is not exactly a straight line, it follows some ancient county boundaries that are there since in the mists of time. Our border is 300 miles long, and it contains 240 crossings. And if you imagine for a moment, the border between Canada and the US contains just 119 crossings. So every minor road, every laneway, every large road has that crossing at some point. And that in itself will present significant problems in the future if we are to go down the route of even attempting to reinstate some sort of border controls between the two countries, and I'll talk about that later on. But if you go there right now, you will see people freely moving back and over across that border. You will see farmers on the northern side of the border producing milk in the morning for it to be shipped across to the south for processing and arrive back in shops in Northern Ireland later that evening. There are no customs, there are no regulatory obstacles to completely free trade. And people living on either side of that border, they've now become accustomed to that, moving back and over without hindrance to shop, to be educated, to receive medical treatment, or simply to visit their neighbours, their friends, and their relations. And that lifestyle, moving back and over freely across the border, has become absolutely normalised at this point. You know, we can have people living in Dublin, booking a holiday departing out of Belfast. We can have, people living in Northern Ireland planning a holiday in Southern Ireland, and not for a moment taking into consideration that they're going to have any issues or any difficulties crossing that border. And I remember, before the securing of the Good Friday Agreement, there was a cycling event called the Maracycle, which is organised by an entity called Cooperation North, which was setting out to normalise the relationship between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland. And 2,000 cyclists arriving from Dublin at the border in Newry to be faced by soldiers with guns. And a very difficult process for us to get through that particular border post just south of Newry and north of Dundalk. That's all gone now. And in doing so, the normalisation of relations between the two counties, between the two communities, has been pretty extraordinary and has fundamentally changed the lives of people, as I say, that live along those border counties. And the economic benefits have been wonderful, that's true, but the human and the societal benefits have been much more immense. And the absence of that physical border is one of the most tangible outcomes and benefits of the peace process. And in short, the EU membership, aligned with the Good Friday Agreement, has made our lives and our relationships on the island relatively normal. So that's really precious to us, and we want to ensure that none of these very significant advances is halted or reversed by Brexit. We cannot see that clock turned back. And I know, and all of us know on the island of Ireland, that the British government actually shares that perspective. And it's because of that shared perspective, and despite some admittedly difficult conversations that have happened along the way, that we were able to reach an agreement between the EU and the UK at the end of last year. Agreement was reached on maintaining a common travel area where both UK citizens and Irish citizens can move freely back and over across the border, and indeed back and over across the Irish Sea between our two countries. Agreement was also reached on protecting that very precious Good Friday Agreement and the gains of the peace process, including avoiding a hard border. But more importantly, we have reached an understanding on how this is going to be achieved. It has been agreed that delivering on these guarantees can either be achieved through a wider future relationship between the EU and the UK, which is our first preference, or through specific solutions which the UK has promised to come forward with. However, and this is important, if these routes fail to deliver on these shared objectives, we now have a fallback or a default agreement in place. And that agreement, that arrangement, would ensure full alignment with those rules of the EU's internal market and customs union necessary to protect North-South cooperation, that all-island economy and the Good Friday Agreement. Having said that, there is an overarching guarantee of avoiding a hard border. And this agreement could not have been achieved without the quite remarkable full solidarity and support of the other 27 EU member states and of its institutions. And that's reflected in the fact that Irish issues are now recognised as very unique within the negotiating process and uniquely protected within the negotiation process all the way to the very end of that particular process. So the focus now in the negotiations is on translating those commitments into the legal and very complex binding text of a future EU-UK withdrawal agreement. It's going to be exceptionally difficult. As I said, it's going to be exceptionally complex, both legally and politically, and there is no doubt we're going to face many challenges in trying to secure that agreement. And we are, at this point in time now, entering another critical period in the negotiation process. The UK needs to engage very positively in the drafting of the withdrawal agreement to demonstrate clearly to all that it will live up to all of the commitments that they gave in the first phase of the negotiations. And it will be for the European Council to judge whether there has been satisfactory progress on these commitments so that work can then be taken forward on finalising a transitional arrangement on scoping out the framework for the EU's longer-term, post-transition future relationship with the UK. As regards later negotiations on the future relationship, these too are also going to raise some very difficult issues. There's going to be particular emphasis, as you might expect, on trade, but there's a wide range of other questions to be settled too, including some fundamental and overarching elements to negotiate. Because if the UK is to indeed enjoy the closest possible relationship with the EU, its own regulatory rules and structures will need to be, at a minimum, closely aligned with that of the European Union. So how can this be achieved? How can it be monitored? How can it be enforced? And ultimately, how will disputes be settled? And the European Union has made it very clear that in the negotiations, it's not going to compromise on the integrity of 4 freedoms of movement: of capital, of people, of goods, and of services. Because this integrity of freedom of movement is the basis for our internal market. It's what lies at the very, very heart of the EU project. So nor can the United Kingdom enjoy privileges and flexibilities outside the EU which it does not have within. As somebody put it quite recently, in short, the UK cannot have its cake and eat it. And being outside cannot be the same as being inside. So within these parameters, I'm sure that the Union will be imaginative, it will be open. Indeed, the growing strength, as we see now, of the EU economy, its new mood of cautious optimism, should allow it to be more generous. If, of course, the UK can settle on what its approach is going to be and bring that clarity of approach to the negotiating table. Its inability thus far to do that is causing concern across Europe. So there remains the hugely difficult question of what has up to now been the free movement of EU workers into the UK. Because after Brexit, that movement of EU workers into the United Kingdom will be simply classed as emigration. And the answer to that is going to have a major impact on the overall EU attitude as the negotiations continue. And the debate around that particular issue is quite fierce at the moment. But we are hopeful that it will be easier to reach agreement on cooperation on issues such as counter-terrorism, combating organised crime, and foreign and security policy. The developing relationship between the EU and NATO, which Ireland supports and will assist in this, as long as the autonomy of the two organisations is clearly respected. Brexit has also had an impact on the political process within Northern Ireland, and despite the best efforts of both governments in recent months, and especially in recent weeks, and particularly through the work of my colleague, Tánaiste Simon Coveney, it is deeply regrettable that there is at present no power-sharing executive in place. However, we won't give up on that. We will continue to work to ensure that power sharing is re-established as soon as possible. And while the immediate disagreement between the parties in Belfast is not actually focused on Brexit, the prospect of the UK exit, whether hard or soft, is now becoming a fundamental political issue in Northern Ireland. A majority of people in Northern Ireland voted against Brexit. However, the two major parties who are negotiating to establish that power-sharing agreement have sharply differing viewpoints on Brexit. So the additional challenge for the political process now in Northern Ireland is to establish some common ground on addressing the practical challenges which arise for Northern Ireland under any scenario. And the Irish government, we're doing our very best to protect the interests of Northern Ireland, which ultimately are also the interests of Ireland as an island. However, there's no substitute for the power-sharing executive as the authentic, the direct voice of the people of Northern Ireland on Brexit, and one which badly needs to be heard in London, in Brussels, and indeed in Dublin. The Irish government wants to work in partnership with the Northern Ireland executive to deal with what are becoming all-island challenges of Brexit. And our strong view is that many of the problems that are posed by Brexit for the island of Ireland, both in terms of protecting the gains of the peace process, but also in terms of our wider political and economic concerns, would simply be best resolved by the UK remaining in the customs and single market, or in something that would be equivalent to that. And slowly but surely, that is now being recognised by many politicians and indeed political commentators in Britain. However, this remains ultimately a decision for the UK, and one which we hope the British government will reflect on very, very carefully. But Ireland faces all of these challenges with one absolute certainty. We are more than ever committed to our membership of the European Union. Because this was the existential choice of our people in 1972, and it has never, not once, been seriously called into question. Indeed, in the most recent polling of people in Ireland, over 80% of Irish people support our continued membership of the EU. Because we as a people fundamentally understand that the EU single market and the EU customs union, they are essential to our economic growth, not least given their importance to attracting United States investment. And as a small country, a tiny little island on the periphery of Europe, we find that our interests and our values are best advanced and protected through a union of hundreds of millions of people. A union itself, actually, when you look at it, is another very successful peace process, and a union that's committed to the rule of law, to human rights, to global trade, and to international cooperation. And as Ireland approaches 100 years on from our independence, we have no wish to retreat back into the British sphere of influence. We are far too attached now to our own place in the world. And as a small, outward-looking country, we remain committed members of the United Nations, and we remain committed to rules-based international order. In 2020, we are seeking election to the UN Security Council, again reflecting our commitment to engaging on issues of international importance. Irish peacekeeping troops have served on peacekeeping missions consistently since 1958. 60 years this year. And our development programme, Irish Aid, for which I have ministerial responsibility, is consistently recognised globally for its delivery of high-quality, untied aid focused on the world's poorest people and countries. So it should be no surprise to anyone then that we are anxious to continue to play our role in shaping the future of the EU, because it's a union that we helped to create. And it's important too to understand that in most European countries, Brexit, while important, is not at the top of their EU agendas. The Union continues to work as normal to address issues such as climate change, fighting terrorism, investment in infrastructure, and indeed strengthening the digital economy. And at the same time, a lively debate has begun on the medium to long-term future of the European Union itself. Ideas, some of them are particularly bold and challenging, are being put forward on such issues as migration, on strengthening the foundations of the euro currency, and European security and defence. And it's in this context that the EU needs and wants the United States as its major international partner in foreign and security policy, in free trade and investment, in protecting the environment. Because together, the EU and the United States are champions of democratic values and of cooperation for prosperity. But of course, circumstances change and partnerships evolve, and the nature of many of the new security challenges facing Europe require a greater collective effort, and not just militarily. There are many people in both the US and in Europe who feel that globalization has not worked for them and that trade has destroyed their jobs. So it's right that we do not assume that we should forever carry on exactly as before, and that we ask ourselves how our policies need to be adjusted. Brexit will, without doubt, change some of the dynamics within the European Union and, let's be fair, will somewhat reduce its international clout. But we are confident of an ongoing close relationship between the EU and the UK, a partnership which will also help to sustain our international relationships, above all with the United States. And we know that the US and the UK have and will continue to have very strong and indeed, in some cases, very unique ties. But this should not be an alternative to or a threat to the EU-US relationship. In the same way, we in Ireland hugely value our very special relationship with the US, which is strengthened by and contributes to the wider EU relationship. And within the European Union, no member state is more committed to free and open trade and investment than Ireland, because we can see in our own country the extraordinary benefits that they can create. And as a global island, we will continue to look outwards and to engage with the world. Indeed, the Taoiseach announced last summer that Ireland is now setting out to double its global footprint. In Chicago, for example, we have just opened an Enterprise Ireland office. And Enterprise Ireland is the government agency responsible for helping Irish companies develop overseas. The departure of the UK from the EU is going to mean the future absence of an important ally in the EU on economic issues, but this makes us all the more determined to work hard with other like-minded countries. This is an agenda on which Europe must continue to work with the US, and we hope in particular that the possibility of a trade and investment partnership between the EU and the US can be examined afresh when the time is right. So, Brexit poses many challenges, and we are not at all naive about the complex problems that we're all going to face. But, as is always the case in solving complex problems, simple and clear answers that are correct will elude us. But I'm certain that by positioning ourselves at the centre of the world and at the heart of Europe, we can meet these challenges and continue to prosper together with our close friends and our close partners. Gura míle maith, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Minister Cannon. We have time for some audience questions now. As a reminder to our live stream audience, you can ask your questions by typing chi.cnf.io into your browser. For our in-person audience, if you have a question, please raise your arm. I will acknowledge you, and a member of our staff will bring a microphone to you. We'll go first to one of our live stream questions. Can you comment on how you're working to engage the Irish diaspora, and especially using technology to do so?
Yes, very much so. A pet project of mine. We have 70 million people all over the world who claim Irish ancestry, who have a very strong affinity with and for Ireland. And like any community internationally, that community is now evolving. For example, here in the United States, the immigration pipeline, if you want to describe it as that led to 33 million Irish Americans claiming Irish ancestry, is more or less turned off at this point. And we need to ensure that as that community evolves over time, as we move on from generation to generation, that all of those Irish Americans, their children and grandchildren, will continue to feel that strong affinity with and for Ireland. So we are currently looking at developing a new technological platform to allow for greater and deeper engagement with our people worldwide. In essence, to build a sense of a digital Irish global community, using technology, using social media, and acknowledging that in a time where we are quickly moving to the ubiquitous use of the smartphone, and at a time where we will have worldwide technological broadband coverage, it is now the time to begin looking at not moving away from, but adding to our traditional method of engagement. Ireland spends €12 million per annum in supporting Irish communities all over the world through our immigrant support programme. And those communities and the people that lead those communities do extraordinary work in nurturing and sustaining those communities. But in some recent research that we had carried out for us here in the United States, we were able to determine that 66% of people in the US who claim Irish ancestry don't have any formal relationship with any Irish community organisation. They are simply there, living in their communities, in their towns, in their cities, in their villages across the US, but don't engage with any Irish community organisations, be it the GAA, Coltus, or any other entity that's out there seeking to support them. So we have to ask the question, why is that the case? So what we want to do is develop, particularly through social media, some platforms of engagement that will allow them to grow and develop their sense of Irishness. We'll be doing it through culture, through heritage, through literature, and through offering them a perspective on what Ireland of the 21st century looks like. We will also be working to develop an opportunity for Irish people who want to come visit Ireland, Irish Americans in particular who want to come visit Ireland, that they would be able to go to the community where their ancestors emanated from and meet leaders within that community who are going to be able to show them, the community, its heartbeat, what makes it unique and what makes it special. So they will be mini ambassadors for every community across the country, every parish across the country. There are 2,500 of those. So all of that work we're doing is a combination of using our people and their innate warmth and hospitality and technology to be able to grow that sense of a global online Irish community in the future, because ultimately that's where every community is moving towards.
We have another question from our online audience. What lessons in
That's
conflict?
a very good example.
What lessons in conflict resolution can we learn in today's uncertain political environment from the Good Friday Agreement?
It's funny because when I speak, as I do, fortunate enough to do so at the United Nations fairly regularly, Ireland is seen as an exemplar of conflict resolution, as a country, an island to be looked up to in terms of how it's resolved conflict on the island itself. And I think the key element right at the very heart of the Good Friday Agreement is mutual respect. It is acknowledging the differences of both communities, acknowledging the history and the heritage of both communities, and respecting that. And if that is your start point, and that I think was the most valuable lesson in terms of getting the Good Friday Agreement off the ground and the process that led to the peace that we've experienced for the last 20 years, was an acknowledgement of the legitimacy of the position of the two main negotiating communities. That's one thing. I also think that it's important to try, if at all possible, to drill down, right down to community level, to see why conflicts are arising in local communities and seeking out people, leaders in both of those local communities that can be leaders in that conflict resolution. Because again, not unlike what we're doing, with the Irish diaspora, you can have people sitting around negotiating tables in Stormont and seeking to secure agreements and ultimately to establish peace. But if the effect of that and the goodwill and the intent of that isn't trickling down into each individual community, and there are no leaders within those communities grabbing that opportunity and running with it, you have a problem. So I think those two things, respecting the history and the traditions of conflicting communities, and then ensuring you have leaders within those communities at local level to move the process on.
Yes, Mr. Bridges, please.
Thank you, Minister. I enjoyed your remarks very much. Can I pick up on one of the points that you alluded to in your speech, which is what happens if the UK and the EU and Ireland don't reach some form of agreement about customs between North and South?
Okay.
And the comments emanating out of Brussels, well, maybe the best thing is for the North to remain in a customs union with the South. Isn't there a risk that that could be seen as incendiary in the North and provocative? And how will the Unionists respond to that?
Okay.
Thank you.
First of all, I hope we don't get there to the point where we have to kick that mechanism in, because that is a mechanism, a backstop now available to us as a result of the protocol agreed during the first phase of the negotiations. So if it transpires that at the end of all of our collective efforts and work and endeavour and ambition to have some sort of customs and trading alignment with the EU and the UK, if that doesn't happen, well then we're obliged to protect the people of our island, North and South, their economies, their societies. And we will do it as sensitively and as expertly as we possibly can, and all the time reassuring particularly the unionist tradition in Northern Ireland, that this is not about, it never has been about, never will be about, deliberately going out there to use Brexit to somehow engineer a united Ireland. That is not the intention. And we've made that very clear, and the Taoiseach in a speech just last week made it clear again. That is not what we're setting out to do. But ultimately, the real damage would be done in Northern Ireland if that border was reinstated, because it is the symbolism of division. It is a symbol of division. And if we can somehow ensure that it doesn't return, and in doing that, we have to kick that protocol into place, well, then so be it. And we will work to reassure the unionist community over and over again, this is not what we're setting out to do. And I think the more reasonable, rational, level-headed members of that community acknowledge, I mean, Northern Ireland voted to remain in the UK, will see that we are working in their interests ultimately in securing peace, in securing the economy and the society of Northern Ireland. And I think they will trust our ambitions in that regard. I really do. And I think certainly with the work that Tánaiste Simon Coveney is doing, he's up there on a very regular basis reassuring the unionist community that, you know, we are working in the interests of everyone on the island of Ireland. I think that work will stand to us in the future elements of the negotiations. Well, London has a problem that has got 10 DUP people to keep happy on, and that's another element which is also presenting a difficulty. But, you know, as Simon Coveney said many, many months ago, you know, we didn't choose to make Brexit happen. We were reacting to Brexit, and we were obliged to protect the interests of everyone on the island of Ireland all the way during that process. And if that means availing of that very unique and special protocol, that there would be alignment in terms of regulatory alignment between trade across the border, well then, so be it ultimately.
Yes, ma'am. In the second row, please.
Hello, and thank you for visiting us.
Thank you.
It's my understanding that prior to the Belfast Agreement, a lot of the funding for the paramilitary groups was actually achieved through, the black market and taking advantage of duty and customs.
Smuggling and so on.
Smuggling and so on. 20 years after the agreement, is there still a present danger that were those boundaries to be reestablished?
Yes.
They would take advantage of that.
In short, we would have that fear, yes. The re-establishment of the border would, would somehow rekindle amongst the more radical elements of both communities that desire to somehow restart the conflict, and would feel that they have a legitimacy in doing so as a result of the re-establishment of the border. And in doing so, I assume, again, the more unsavoury elements of those particular communities would again use the re-establishment of the border as an opportunity to make money, to trade, smuggle, whatever you want to call it. They did that in the past, both communities. There's no reason to expect they wouldn't do it in the future. But as I say, we're not expecting to be at that point, at any point in the future, but it is the case that if it were to be re-established, it has the potential to begin unravelling the Northern Ireland peace process, which is why we're so protective of it and why we're so insistent that we cannot return to that position of having any kind of a border.
Yes, ma'am. In the second to last row, please.
Thank you very much for this. I just returned from Northern and Southern Ireland and was very perturbed by what I saw and heard and felt. And from your perspective, do you think that Northern Ireland is going to go with Brexit? Is that settled?
Well, okay, Northern Ireland voted to remain, but the whole of the UK, of which Northern Ireland is a part, voted to leave. So at this point in time, it is the plan that the whole of the UK would leave the EU, including Northern Ireland.
That's not what we felt when we were there.
But if you talk to, and I have done, individual members of the Northern Ireland communities from both sides of the divide, if you want to describe it as that, the people I'm speaking to are very anxious that Northern Ireland would remain in some shape or form, having a free, open and seamless movement of people and goods and services back and over across the border. And as I said earlier on, the provision is there now that ultimately if the UK decides during the negotiation process to completely absent itself from some kind of customs union and free trade agreement, well then we will have no option as a country, as an island, to kick into place a provision that we've already agreed, a protocol that we've already agreed, where Northern Ireland's regulatory regime would mimic exactly that of the EU, thus allowing us to continue trading seamlessly and freely every day. While it technically wouldn't be a member of the EU, it would, for all intents and purposes, look like a member of the EU. It
So
would
you
trade
think there
like a
could
member of
be-
the EU.
there could
But
be
it wouldn't
something-
technically be a member of the EU.
But you did mention that there was a divisiveness in the group that now are being supposed to be the protectorate, that they
Well,
were, there was some angst on both sides.
well, there's angst on both sides.
I don't mean from
There's-
Northern and Southern, I mean in Northern Ireland.
Yeah, I mean, there's fear that there's somehow, during this very, very uncertain time we all face into, that there might be the re-establishment in some shape or form, even, in the most weakened but there will be some sort of re-establishment of some kind of a border. That's where the fear arises within both communities of that happening, because that border was a symbol of division. That's what it was ultimately. And symbols are very powerful. They move people to do things that they mightn't do otherwise. And to have that border re-established would be very dangerous and could seriously threaten the long-term viability of the Northern Ireland peace process.
So you do feel you have a positive feeling?
I
that
feel
this
very
is going to
positive.
happen?
I do. I genuinely do. I think ultimately, as we move towards, which are now the crucial elements of the negotiation, certainly from later this month onwards, I think there'll be a dawning realisation that the UK has to work in the interests of all of the people of the British, from the UK.
There was much divisiveness that we felt.
The divisiveness, I don't feel it at this point in time. I don't. And I think it's probably emanating from some of the more radical members of the communities in Northern Ireland. But if you talk to rational, level-headed people who have enjoyed that incredible peace, that security, that knowing that they can walk freely throughout their towns and their cities, that they can trade freely with their neighbours back and over across the border, that is incredibly precious to them. And they don't want to see that threatened. And I think their voices will be heard in the negotiation process.
Thank you.
I really think that.
Yes, ma'am. On the side, please.
Hi, Minister Cannon. Thank you for your remarks. As one of those people that grew up in the area, right on the border, and grew up, unfortunately, through the conflict and has now moved to that normal place that it is, I've yet to meet one person that actually wants a hard border, whether it's from either side of the parties in Northern Ireland, from either side of the border in Ireland. I've yet to meet one person who thinks it's a good idea. But my question to you is, obviously there's a lot of negotiations going on now. As you said, we're in a critical phase. What is the timeline? What's the deadline? When do you see that we might have to move to that critical point where you have to enforce something rather than reaching an agreement?
Between now and October, the next 6 months are critical because that is where we negotiate the minutiae of the withdrawal, every element of the withdrawal and the likely long-term impact of the withdrawal. Withdrawal is happening in March of next year. So between now and October, that's the critical element. But having pointed that out, during the first phase of the negotiations, we had certain significant concessions made to us by the EU and the UK, reflecting the very unique relationship between the two communities, north and south of the border. And they are going to be protected all the way during the process. I can assure you of that. So there needs to be at this point, and it isn't forthcoming, some clarity from the British government as to what exactly they are suggesting for the border. What's it going to look like? There's been this thing about technology which doesn't at all reflect the free movement of food, of animals, of livestock back and over across that border every day. I heard a report from the House of Lords published last week saying that it would take a minimum of 8 to 10 years to put such technology in place, considering there are 240 crossings of the border. So I think that canard needs to be set aside. It's not going to work. The more rational, level-headed people acknowledge that it simply isn't going to work. The easiest solution is for the EU and the UK to somehow negotiate the UK remaining within the customs union. And I think ultimately, over time, certainly in the next 8 to 10 weeks, there will be some clarity emanating from the British government on exactly that. And I do think that in making that clarity known to us, I think their position will be a bit more measured, a bit more conciliatory, and a bit more cognizant of the interests of the whole of the UK community, not alone in Northern Ireland, but indeed across the other island as well. And I think as the realisation dawns upon them that their interests are best served, and I think it will, best served by remaining in some sort of customs union, I think ultimately that's where we're going to move to.
Yes, ma'am. In the third row, please.
Minister, we hear a lot about the challenges that Brexit poses for the Irish economy and
Opportunities?
Yes, what I was going to actually. And we hear about the challenges, but you also hear about benefits.
Yeah.
So, how do you think Ireland's positioned to maximise those benefits? Like, is Dublin ready to be a viable alternative to companies moving people out of the financial services in the city? Like, can you speak to that a little?
Okay. Dublin is, and Dublin always has been, and we certainly don't want to give the impression that somehow we're going to use Brexit as an opportunity to begin poaching companies from London or elsewhere. We're not. But in the event that companies choose to relocate outside of London or outside of the UK ultimately because of the challenges that they will face post-Brexit, Ireland is saying we're open for business, and we always have been. There are 45, for example, in the area of fintech and financial service, there are 45,000 people working in financial services in Ireland. There's incredibly deep expertise now developed over the last 20 years in that area. That would be a significant opportunity for Ireland. What we're also saying, I was in the Middle East last week in Kuwait and Qatar. Again, I met with a number of companies, Middle East companies, who were contemplating establishing their first ever base in the EU. What we're saying to them is, come to Ireland, use Ireland as that base into a market of 500 million people. Post-Brexit, we will be the only English-speaking common law country in the whole of the EU, the only English-speaking country in the Eurozone, and the IDA in particular has consistently positioned Ireland as a launch pad for international business, again from the US obviously as well, into the European Union. So the challenges are going to be very, very significant. Particularly for our SMEs, particularly for our farmers. And the government has recently established a €300 million loan fund at a very low interest rate for SMEs and for those involved in the food and agri sector who are going to face significant challenges, no doubt about that. But we do see opportunities, and the main opportunity we see is for people and industry contemplating locating in the EU for the first time, wanting to locate themselves in an English-speaking, business-friendly country. And Ireland is it in terms of what the possibilities are.
Is the infrastructure there, do you think, in Dublin to accommodate a big influx?
It is. I mean, the infrastructure is there, and certainly in terms of technological capability. And if you were to visit Dublin, I don't know when you were in Dublin last, but there's a building, a floor right up on the top of Leinster House, and you look out over Dublin, it is a plethora of construction cranes at the moment. There's a huge momentum underway now in the development of commercial space, commercial office space, and an acknowledgement that we need to do exactly that. And for example, Facebook invested another 35 million in a whole new building, Microsoft last week and opened that. So there is an acknowledgement now that there's a long-standing and deep expertise in the areas of ICT, financial services, medtech, and life sciences. There are 4 strengths in terms of our international investment. And as I say, being the only English-speaking country in the European Union after Brexit, I think will enhance our position in terms of attracting in FDI, international FDI. But notwithstanding that, it's going to pose a major challenge to our SMEs that are based on the island of Ireland and export to the UK every day. We have €1 billion of trade every single week between the two islands, so it's extraordinary. And bear in mind, there's something very interesting. 40% of Ireland's agricultural produce is exported to the UK, but 45% of the UK's agricultural produce is exported to Ireland. So it's an extraordinary relationship. It really is, food moving back and over across the Irish Sea every day. So again, I think, the farmers of the UK, I think they're also reflecting on what the future holds for them. The fishermen of the UK are reflecting on what the future holds for them. So I think the realities of the really long-term impact of Brexit are beginning to dawn on the EU business, or the British business community as a whole, and I think they'll bring their voice to be heard pretty soon in the process.
Yes, ma'am, in the fourth row, please.
What do you think it'll take to get the politicians in Stormont to start working together again?
Pretty much tried everything at this point. I think, kind of ironically, I think Brexit will be a major impetus in bringing them together. And, you know, as we now move into that crucial negotiation phase between now and October, for the British or for the Northern Ireland communities not to have a voice, a unified, a coherent, a cohesive voice at the table will be damaging in terms of the outcome for Northern Ireland. And I think the people of Northern Ireland just don't want that to happen. They don't want to see 27 European Union countries, Westminster, all at this, and Dublin at this table, discussing ultimately their future, and they not having a substantial presence at that table. So I think the immediacy of the upcoming negotiations will play a major role. And again, I think, we spoke earlier on about what brought those two communities together in the first place. It was mutual respect of their both long-standing traditions. I think that respect is a bit missing at the moment in terms of the negotiations that are ongoing. And I think people on both sides of the negotiations are being incredibly unreasonable in some of the more juvenile aspects of the, you know, they're just not reflecting on their role as leaders within that community in terms of protecting its future. But I think we will see some substantial progress over the next number of weeks. Yeah.
Yes, sir, in the last row, please.
There's just a question there with when you mentioned the DUP and the Tory party. What will happen with the crucial from now to October? What's the chance of the DUP and the Tory party splitting up? And what cards? It's sort of like everybody's playing poker now at this.
Well, I think if we move to a point, and I'm hoping we don't, but if we move to a point where that protocol that allows Northern Ireland to remain part of the EU regulatory regime, distinct and separate from the EU, I think, or from the UK, I think that might begin to present a problem for Theresa May and her long-term stability of her government. We're not there yet. I'm hoping we don't get there, but that could be the thing that unlocks that instability. But again, I think, you know, if the DUP and indeed other representatives, both locally and nationally and internationally, of the Northern Ireland communities, they're going to hear some pretty loud noises in their ears in the next number of weeks in terms of protecting the future of Northern Ireland, societally and economically. And if the DUP and others are listening to what their people are saying, they will act in the best interest of Northern Ireland. And for the DUP, that for me means remaining in government. Because why would you extricate yourself from the most crucial negotiations ever to have taken place about the future of your communities in Northern Ireland? Would be a very unwise thing to do. And I don't think they'd be thanked for it, to be frank. Going back, 10 of them leaving the Westminster saying, we've collapsed the government at the most crucial phase of the negotiations. I think they are also reflecting on the long-term implications of such a decision.
We have time for one final question, and we'll go to one from our live stream audience. Can you comment on the state of U.S.-Ireland relations since the Trump administration has taken office, and where do you see the greatest opportunities for increased collaboration with the administration?
I mean, the relationship between Ireland and the US is extraordinary. It always has been, and it always will be. It has endured significant challenges in the past. I'm sure it will endure significant challenges in the future. And I was talking to an historian recently, and he told me an extraordinary figure. He's a statistician, a historian, and he studies immigration. That's his thing. And he said that from 1840 to 1850, every second person setting foot on US soil for the first time was Irish. And we are still seeing that tangible legacy is still there. I mean, you walk down the streets of this city and, you know, half the business names over the doors are Irish. You know, you look at people who are leaders in politically and economically and societally in this city, a huge proportion of them are Irish. So those personal people-to-people relationships will endure long after any challenge that might arise. So and I mean, that's why the Taoiseach is in Washington today as we speak. That's why I have 3 other colleagues in this country right now for the next couple of days to affirm and to respect that relationship, to acknowledge that it's very, very important to both of us. For example, US companies currently employ 130,000 people in Ireland, but interestingly, Irish companies employ 100,000 people here in the US. So, you know, that relationship has endured for many, many years, and I'm sure it will endure in the future. And I think as we live in an ever more fractured world, and a world full of, I mean, a lot of conflict, a lot of hatred, I think it is leaders within Ireland, within the EU, and within the US who will come to the fore in ensuring that those things that are precious to us, peace, respect for each other's traditions, the rule of law, those leaders have always come to the fore in the past. I mentioned George Mitchell earlier on, you know, John F. Kennedy, all these people who cherish the very unique and distinct relationship that exists between Ireland and the US. I think it is exceptionally healthy right now. I think it's going to even get more healthy in the future. And again, I think a lot of it's going to happen through technology, through a new wave of Americans who come study, live and work in Ireland and the EU, and consequently, and also a number of Irish young people. There's a whole new generation of Irish young people now making their homes here in the US. And as they do, I think that relationship between the two countries will deepen ever further in the future. So and every time I come to America, and I'm fortunate I've been here a number of times now in the last 6 months, I'm always impressed by the depth and the breadth of that relationship. And I'm very, very confident about the future of it, to be frank. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Minister Cannon. Again, thank you very much to the staff at the Irish Consulate and to the Ireland Network Chicago for their assistance with this program. Please now join me in thanking Minister Cannon.